Greetings, everyone. This is Chapter 2 in Unit 1. This is about the founding and the Constitution. Just some things to remember. I'm sure you've probably heard all about the founding in grade school, high school. But just for kicks, let's kind of do a synopsis. Remember, we were founded by colonists who were immigrating from Western Europe, namely from England, but you had people from Holland and Spain and other parts of Western Europe. And basically what they were fleeing was religious and social and economic oppression. In Great Britain, you couldn't own land. You were told where to live and you were told what to do. You were told when you could hunt. You were told when you couldn't hunt and fish and all that kind of stuff. And if you disobeyed the rules, then you were kicked off of your land, and then you were a person without a kingdom, without a home. So there wasn't a whole lot to strive for. There wasn't any notion that, man, one day we could have a swimming pool and a 2-story house, or our own business, or own our own cattle. It didn't happen. It was all owned by the crown, the sovereign, the king. And in this case, King George III, who was the sovereign over Great Britain at this time. You also had religious oppression because you had the Catholic Church at this time. And we're not talking about the Catholic doctrine, but we're talking about administration of the Catholic Church at this time was very much in alignment with the royalty, the crown, the sovereigns, the kings and queens around Western Europe, in an effort to just keep people under control. And what the Catholic Church started doing was basically telling people, well, if you sin, we can only forgive you if you pay us. It was called the selling of indulgences. If you started to believe differently, or if you didn't do everything that the church wanted you to do, if you wanted to study science and math, or look at the stars and study astronomy, that was bad. Knowledge was bad. Because then you started questioning things, okay? Then you started questioning things, and absolute rulers that take control over every aspect of your life, don't like that. And so finally, it came to a point where there was a group of Christians who began to break away from the Catholic Church. They were called Protestants. They're still called Protestants. The root word there being protest. They were protesting some of the practices of the Catholic Church, not the doctrine, but some of the practices of the clergy and the administration of the Catholic Church, because they wanted to learn how to read and study and be open and not being worried about burning at the stake and not having to pay to have their sins forgiven. Life was not very enjoyable during these times. There's a lot of hunger, disease, religious persecution, economic persecution. And there were these thinkers, people started questioning. And again, very, very scary to kings and queens and popes and clergy. They started to question, there's nothing in the Bible that says I have to pay for my sins. There's nothing in the Bible that says I can't learn to read. There's nothing in the Bible that bans education. Why is all this going on? And they started getting burned at the stake and in the stockade and thrown into jail, these Protestants. Until finally, a group of Protestants said, you know what, this burning at the stake thing doesn't look like a lot of fun. Let's figure out a way to go to this new world we've heard so much about. So these are the Pilgrims. They hopped a ride on a trading ship called the Mayflower, and they landed in Plymouth Rock and carved out a way in the new world. And soon others came, fleeing persecution. That was our first wave of colonists, were those religious fanatics that were trying to carve out a new relationship with the divine. Let's call it that. And they colonized, they grew food, they had livestock, they had communities. And then as more of these religious fanatics came over, then word got out that this new world, this America we've heard so much about, is so rich in natural resources. Wood for building things, plenty of fertile ground to grow things, new types of fruits and vegetables, plenty of open plains for livestock, gold, silver, copper. I mean, the list just went on and on. And at this point, Western Europe was overpopulated. They had run out of lumber to build things, and they really depleted a lot of their natural resources. So they came more people seeking economic freedom started landing on our shores, and they started importing and exporting goods. Our tobacco was better than European tobacco. Our lumber was better. Our produce was better. And people made lots of money. And this is when the plantation system started, because as these big farming operations just grew larger and larger and they gained more land and more land, well, guess what? You had to have people. You had to have laborers, because, you didn't have all this farming equipment like you do today. It's important to note that the slave trade had already been outlawed in Western Europe. We were not the first or the only country on the planet to use slaves the way that we did, but we were the last civilized area. And so we started importing the Black Africans to work on these big plantations. And everything was kind of rolling along. I mean, the colonies were thriving. There were systems of government that were set up that were liaisons or linked to the sovereign government in England. And they kind of left us alone because, the Europeans figured, good grief, if those people want to go and live in that wild land way across the ocean, let them. And they left us alone for a long time until war broke out. And this was called the 7 Years' War in Europe. And it was a big war for its time and what it was. And King George III, the sovereign of Great Britain, overseeing all of this happening, amassed a large war debt for participation in the 7 Years' War and didn't know how to pay it back. And, the way these kingdoms work, if the sovereign, if the king doesn't have, or queen, doesn't have the money to pay for soldiers and protection and keep all the people living in the kingdom happy and fed and this and the other, then guess what? The kingdom falls apart and it gets taken over by another kingdom. And King George saw that as a real possibility with not having money to pay off this war debt. So he asked his council, his advisors, where can we raise some money? And they said, well, the colonies are doing really well. All those crazy people that left to go to America because they wanted to worship differently and live amongst these wild native people, and they're doing really well. Lots of lumber, lots of produce, lots of land, lots of minerals. Let's start taxing the colonies. And so the first tax was called the Stamp Act, and it was just basically anything that you bought that had this certain British stamp on it, you had to pay taxes for. And then that increased to include sugar and paper, eventually tea, which was kind of the last straw. Everybody's heard about the Boston Tea Party. Boston Tea Party is when the tax on tea came about, and the colonists in Massachusetts just went berserk. They boarded a British ship that was filled with, I think it was like 1,400 kilos of tea, and dumped it all in Boston Harbor. And then this was, considered an act of domestic terrorism. And it infuriated King George because it was his tea. And the king was not used to people protesting and standing up. Because remember what we talked about in chapter 1, if you didn't follow all the rules in this time frame in Western Europe, you just got kicked out of the kingdom. You had nowhere to live, nowhere to make money, and you basically were a person without a country. You didn't know much because you couldn't read and you couldn't study anything. You didn't have any options. So the king was not accustomed to people pushing back. But the colonists, after this generation that they've had of prosperity and freedom and being able to worship the way they wanted to and build their own homes and guide their own destiny, they weren't going to go back. And their problem was not that they were being taxed. I mean, they realized they were a part of the British Empire and there was a certain amount of benefit that came to that. What they were really upset about was that they didn't have a voice. They had become so accustomed after this generation of living as colonists that they couldn't believe that they weren't consulted. And then secondly, they didn't get to keep any of the taxes to benefit their own communities, to better their own communities, while it was their labor that was producing all of this cotton and tobacco and whiskey and lumber and mining of gold and copper and silver. And this was a new frame of mind that had been birthed on this planet. And I think a lot of Americans have forgotten that never really before had you had this amount of free thinking and destiny. There was a philosopher, and you'll want to remember his name, John Locke, who was one of these Renaissance thinkers, when people started kind of opening up to the fact that, wait, why don't we have more control over our lives? Why do we have to live this way? And he came up with this theory that everybody, when they land on this planet, has a God-given right to determine their destiny. That just because your father was a butcher or a welder, it doesn't mean that you have to be a butcher or welder. You can be whatever you want to be, because that's not the way it was before. The divine right of self-determination, that each and every one of us, each and every one of you listening to this lecture, has a divine right to captain your own destiny. You want to be in computer coding or wind technology or nursing or dental hygiene. You get to choose that. It's not chosen for you. Okay? So this begins the revolution in thought, the revolution against British taxation without representation, and it leads to the Revolutionary War. I don't spend a whole lot of time on the Revolutionary War because, we won, right? And so here's what happens after the Revolutionary War ends. You have these patriots, you know their names: Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. The list goes on and on. You don't have to know all the founders' names, but what you do have to understand is these were the people that were the liaisons, the connection between the communities in the Northeast, the original 13 colonies, which are now the 13 states. And so after the Revolutionary War ends, these same leaders get together and, they're kind of like the dog who caught the car. Like, oh, okay, we beat Great Britain in this revolution for freedom and these ideas that we have about people governing themselves and the divine right of self-determination. What do we do now? How do we really do this? So there weren't a whole lot of models. The Greeks had a system of democracy, but it was more of what's called a direct democracy based in small city-states. Direct democracy meaning, if the Trojans all want, the people who lived in Troy wanted to decide whether or not to go to war, they'd all meet in the town square and the leader would say, do we want to go to war? And All those in favor say yes. The majority said yes, then they went to war. That's a direct democracy because you have a direct impact. It's like when you elect your homecoming queen or king or class president. That's a direct democracy. What we have is an indirect democracy where communities of interest, those districts we talked about in chapter 1 and states, they elect people to speak for the majority of voters. So the entire country is based on a majority rule with minority rights concept. Sounds easy, huh? What wasn't easy, because you get these 13 now states in a conference room in Philadelphia, and they have to figure out how are we going to construct this indirect democracy? How are we going to allow the now states to keep their own identities and serve their own communities, but also have a strong central government that can provide for the common good? And this was perplexing because the states now, the then colonies, now states, were very diverse even back then. Remember, the first wave of colonists were those protesting the Catholic Church, the Protestants, the religious fanatics. Christianity did not look the same way then that it does now. And it won't look the same way in 100 years as it does now. Everything kind of changes and evolves as we grow and evolve and learn. So the original colonies that were settled by those religious protesters, the Protestants, were more into the trade. But then when you had the second wave coming through for economic benefit, that's when you started seeing the plantations come about. And that's where you started to see a lot of wealth be built through the use of slaves, through the agriculture, livestock, mining, all this stuff. And so the states from Maryland down to Georgia were very different in their ideology. Slavery was a problem from the beginning. Those religious folks in the higher colonies, the higher states along the Northeast, were very anti-slavery for religious, moral, humanitarian reasons. But then when you got down from Maryland to Georgia, those states had very different economic structure, very different set of values. So how do you get these two diverse economies to meld and come under one federal government? The first attempt at this is called the Articles of Confederation. This was the first document that governed our country. And basically what it did was it gave states all the power, okay, all the power. They didn't have to contribute anything to the federal government. They could make their own deals with other countries for goods. And this seemed to be okay with the majority of those at that conference in Philadelphia, because it allowed the states to continue to service their own culture, their own communities, their own economy, the way they wanted it done. The Articles of Confederation in the United States under the Articles of Confederation lasted more or less about 8 years. And by the end of those 8 years, the new fledgling United States of America was really struggling. And, you know, a lesser, more dedicated group of people might have found this a good time to just sort of go back to the king, go back to Great Britain and say, hey, look, this whole democracy thing is really hard. And, you know, now we're kind of poor and hungry and rudderless and directionless. Can we please come back? But they didn't. And this is another thing as we as Americans need to remember. Not everything works the first time. It takes all of our input. It takes both sides coming together, taking the best ideas from different political cultures to come together to make the best solution that will benefit the majority. So the original founders came back and they said, all right, that didn't work. What do we do now? Well, it was obvious that we needed a stronger central government. Okay, so that was the first thing. But how were we going to have a federal government but still have the states be the most powerful to be able to govern themselves? Well, the solution was a bicameral Congress. Bicameral, bi is two, cameral is chamber. Two chambers. The House of Representatives is where people are represented. Every state gets 2 senators. Okay, that was the compromise. And this is the branch of government where people are represented by population in the House, where states are represented by population in the House, with all states equally represented in the Senate. All states get 2 senators. So little bitty Rhode Island gets 2 senators, big bad Texas gets 2 senators, but Rhode Island has 1 representative and Texas has 36. These were larger in population. So that was a way to kind of balance out. They also created the executive branch of government, which is the presidency, and all the agencies and advisors and councils and members of the bureaucracy that advise the president. And then they created the third branch of government, which is the judiciary. And this is where the Constitution is interpreted. The Constitution creates the 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, which is Congress, and the judicial, which is the federal court system. Each one of these branches has a check and a balance over the other. Okay, this is all laid out in the Constitution. How do we keep the presidency from becoming too powerful? How do we keep Congress or the court system from becoming too powerful? We make sure that each one has a check over the other. So there's a good diagram about this in your book. I would suggest that you look closely at that. So for example, if Congress passes a law, and we'll go through the steps on how a bill becomes a law in one of the other units, but let's say Congress passes a law. And remember, Congress is where people are represented. And by population in the House, and all states get 2 senators. And each piece of legislation has to go through both houses. So they pass a law. And it gets to the president. And the president says, I really don't like this law. This wasn't a part of my deal. This isn't a part of my agenda. So I'm going to veto it. Veto, Latin for no. But it's not over, because a president can veto an act of Congress, but then it goes back to Congress. And if Congress can get a supermajority of votes, then guess what? That bill passes into law anyway. If that bill passes into law and the people or a state or an organization have a problem with it, maybe believe that it violates the Constitution or that it isn't fair, then guess what? It goes to the court system. And it's there where the courts look at what this law does. Is it in alignment with the Constitution as that relates to society at present? Okay, so you'll want to remember there are 3 co-equal branches of government. If someone says, oh, the president is the most powerful, your answer to that is no, because the presidency is a co-equal branch of government. Congress is where laws are made. The presidency brings a vision, a direction to the country, and the judiciary ensures that acts of Congress, acts of the presidency are in alignment with where the country stands at that time as it relates to the Constitution. So what does that mean? The Constitution is written in mostly what's called implied language or given implied powers. Implied means something that's suggested, okay? if I tell you guys, it'd be a good idea if you studied implied power in your chapter on the Constitution, might help you out a little bit. I'm implying that would be a good idea. I'm suggesting that would be a good idea. Other than me expressly stating, if you don't study this in chapter 2, you're going to fail. So you better look at this. And if you don't, it's all on you. I'm expressly laying it out. Okay. So a lot of the Constitution is not direct. It doesn't lay out a perfect step-by-step manual on how to handle everything. It's open-ended. And I've had students ask me in the past before, well, God, if the founders were so smart, then why did they leave so much of this to the imagination? Well, look at it this way. There is no way that the founders could have predicted 4 airplanes hijacked and attacking the United States in New York, at the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and then the plane that crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. They couldn't have predicted how to handle that. Right? But the Constitution gives us some directives. It gives us some directives. You'll want to look at how we manage, how we grow, how we evolve as that relates to constitutional language. Okay, so pay special attention to those things in chapter 2. If you have any questions, need any clarification, please let me know. You can always email me at elizabeth.bryant@tstc.edu. Y'all enjoy your chapter.